Welcome to the WanderLearn Show. I'm your host, Tapon. This is one of my 3 episodes featuring Alex Hutchinson. He is the author of a brand new book that just came out in 2025 called The Explorer's Gene. He wrote a best-selling book about endurance called Endurance. This book explores the topic of whether or not there is a gene that pushes us to explore and all the implications around exploring. So episode 1 talks about whether or not there's a gene. Episode number 2 talks about how technology has impacted our desire to explore. It also touches on the question of whether exploration is required to have a fulfilling life. Episode number 3 is about exercising your explorer muscle. Exploring versus exploiting. And exploiting is, by the way, not a bad term in this context. And finally, we revisit the question about whether exploration and the desire for exploration is in our DNA. Alex is a fascinating, profound individual. I appreciated his book, and I hope you appreciate this podcast with him. One of the premises of the book, or at least one of the explorations that you're trying to do, is there a gene for exploration? What percentage of human beings do you think show a desire for exploration? Because here's a hypothesis, is that we all started in Africa, but there was a subset of an African tribe that said, you know what, screw this continent. We're leaving. We're walking out. And those guys and their descendants obviously must have had some very, a desire for exploration. And it's kind of been that way in every society. And it feels like maybe that 20% of society has this exploring genes, but most of us are more sedentary kind of. Where would you put the finger if you had to guess your percentage of, not necessarily a gene, we'll get into that next, but you understand my question.
Yeah. I mean, so first of all, what I'll say is I think 99.9999999% of people explore less than you do. So if we're talking about the anecdotal case for an explorer's gene, like let's get you into the lab and figure out what's going on. So I would argue, or I guess the way I would answer that question, and it's an annoying dodging the question sort of answer, is that I think it's much more on a continuum. So I think, and maybe we'll get into this, there are some individual genetic markers that I think played a role in that exodus from Africa and how populations spread around the world. Does someone who listens to avant-garde music, are they exploring in some similar way as to someone who wants to visit every country in the world? And I think I would answer yes. I mean, there's probably some differences, but I think the fundamental drive for novelty, for learning new things, for experiencing the thrill of going somewhere where you don't know what's going to happen around the next corner, I think that can happen in a lot of different contexts. So whether it's 20% or 30%, I honestly, maybe, yeah, I think it's less than 50% who have this really strong drive for novelty, but I think everyone is on that continuum in some way.
That's a good answer. That makes sense to me, especially after reading your book. And one of the things in your book, if you look at the cover, you see a guy kind of trudging through the snow in a mountainous terrain. But the point of the book is not purely like mountain hikers and outdoors people and people who go sailing across the world and all that kind of stuff. As you kind of alluded to, somebody who's just looking for new music and is out there and there's a whole chapter or 2 where you kind of broaden the definition. Can you expand about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, the genesis of the book. So I like, not to the same extent as you, but I like getting, I have a different desire in terms of traveling. I like getting where people aren't. I like having the illusion that I'm treading somewhere for the first time.
Yes.
And so that's been a theme in my travel of seeking out really remote backcountry. But where I started to connect this to broader themes is my last book came out in 2018, and it was about the science of endurance. And it had been a topic that I was really writing about for almost exclusively for more than a decade. So I had become very narrowed, but the book was successful, and I thought the smart thing to do, the Harvard Business School advice is get Endure 2 in the pipeline, capitalize on the success. And I just found myself drawn to what I found is that I thought that doesn't sound fun to me. I want to do something different. And I didn't necessarily know what I wanted to do different. I just knew I wanted it to be different. And so I started thinking about this attraction to the unknown, to something new, to something different. for me, that was in the context of a career path. And I started to like, is that the same thing that motivates me to not want to go to the Great Barrier Reef, but to want to go to the Ningaloo Reef in another part of Australia? That I don't want to go where everyone else is going, or is there, are there commonalities? So that was what started me down this path. And so I think the common thread is the desire to seek out paths where the outcome is not foreseeable, where you don't actually know how it's going to turn out until you get there, and that's not a negative, that's a positive. You're excited about the chance that because it means you're going to learn something new about the world. So I think that these physical and intellectual forms of exploration are absolutely wired by the same or with the same circuits.
Everybody likes, well, not everybody likes a good surprise. In fact, I learned about that the other day when this was actually several years ago when I wanted to surprise a friend of mine with a surprise kind of birthday party. And then they said, no, you shouldn't do that because some people would rather just enjoy knowing for a whole week that their party's coming up. And you're going to, the, some people just really, they have a low tolerance for surprises, even good ones. But
Well,
other people, they chase the novelty and like, you know what? This is great. I have no electricity. Wow, what an adventure.
yeah, and that's the story of my vacations. It's like, oh wow, everything went wrong. Like we're lost in the wilderness. This is awesome. But at the same time, like I can remember with my kids, like someone gave us a Jack in the Box, and which was a neat little toy. You press a button and it jumps out and plays some music. And I remember like, oh hey, here, like Ella, my daughter, check out the Jack in the Box. Press the button, it springs out, and she's just wailing for 10 minutes. And I was like, oh. Yeah, that surprise was not a good surprise for her, and it was sort of that. And there's actually been then research that I came across while researching the book about like the tolerance of kids for novelty and surprise, and they like things that are so you can end up with this sort of bell curve shaped thing where if there's no surprise, it's boring to a kid. Like if you're talking about things that they might play with. If it's too surprising, like a Jack in the Box, they hate it. But there's a sweet spot in the middle where there's some aspect of surprise. And I guess the thing to understand is everyone's curve is different. And even within a given person, our curves are different for different aspects of our lives, depending on. So I may have a high tolerance for physical like adventuring because
Discomfort.
I've and discomfort and fear a little bit and like not knowing whether it's safe crossing rivers and stuff because I've done a lot of it. So it's not way out on my discomfort zone. Whereas someone who hasn't done that before, even if they're strong and capable and like surprises, if they're unfamiliar with it, it might be different to them. And then also, not only does it vary from individual to individual and within domains, or it varies within individuals over time, depending on what else is going on in your life. There are times when you're going to really want to explore. Maybe there are times when you've got stuff going on in your life and you really want to go back and just listen to the same music over and over again. I've noticed that in myself. It's like when life is complicated, I just want to listen to the albums that I loved when I was 19.
True. Alex, I really enjoyed your book, The Explorer's Genius. I encourage anybody to get it. It's down in the links below. And one of the things that some people might wonder is, oh, what did you conclude? Is there an explorer's gene? Is it a cocktail of DNA that kind of determines what did you learn?
Yeah, the title is let's call it deliberately provocative,
Right.
or a conversation starter.
But you definitely start the book in the first, I think the first couple of chapters, you dive right into it.
Yeah, and I should, there was a National Geographic article in 2012 that kind of seeded my interest in this aspect of it, that talked about a gene that's related to a specific dopamine receptor called DRD4. And there's different variants of the gene. And so some people have effectively a more sensitive dopamine receptor, meaning that they get a bigger jolt out of uh, the sensation of novelty and risk. This is a gene that's also linked to ADHD, not surprisingly, because these are people who are maybe not content with just feeling bored and always feeling driven to go find new stimulation. And so anyway, there is this gene. We have different dopamine receptors, and the insight from a 1999 study that I found absolutely fascinating was that the gene variant arose about 50,000 years ago, and that's roughly when humans started really spreading around the world, from Africa and the Near East. And if you trace the migration paths of different populations, so you ask how far in the last 50,000 years or the last 20,000 years, say, did these people move from where the population was before? So if, some populations may have moved from the Near East to Britain, others went all the way to the southern tip of South America, which is, that's about as far as you can go, at least, following land travel.
Starting from Africa.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Which is where according to current theories, at least, where we all started. And so if you then go and take blood samples and measure or look for the presence of this explorer's version of the DRD4 gene, you find that it's basically a linear relationship. The farther a population has migrated, the more likely, the higher the prevalence of this explorer's gene. So in some of the population groups in South America, it's sort of 80% have this explorer's gene. In some populations much closer in Europe, they might be down at 10 or 20%. And so I know this gets into some tricky territory, like, because I think, and this goes back to your question about what's the percent and is it a on or off switch versus a spectrum. And so I think it's not that people in South America are every one of them is an explorer, and people in Sardinia, none of them explore. That's not how it works. Because ultimately what this is telling us is that this reward circuitry that's in all of our brains drives us to explore. And some of us have a little bit more of it than others, but we all have the same circuitry. And there's almost certainly other factors that then play into how we respond to novelty. But in that sense, so the explorer's gene is not a totally fatuous title, because there is a gene that has been linked to population movements, and it turns out there's similar DRD4 gene variants in other animals, and you see similar effects. Where, like, one study that I thought was interesting, they looked at some islands off the coast of Sweden that had been populated by frogs maybe 100 years ago, and if you took the frogs on the island, they were more likely to have this DRD4 gene, and if you took mainland frogs and island frogs, and you raised them under identical conditions, the island frogs were more exploratory. They would cover greater ground. They wanted to get out, and they were bolder. So there are differences that show up that are biological in origin.
It makes sense.
Even though in the human condition, all of these things are subtle, right? It's not an on-off switch, but they are. It's biological.
It reminds me of a very good friend of mine I've known for 20 years. And she told me, Francis, if you ever have children, you have to warn the mother about your genetic background, because my father left France on a boat going to Argentina. Then he went to the United States. And my mom left Chile at 25 years old, practically a one-way trip to go to San Francisco, and they met in San Francisco. So both of my parents were kind of quite adventurous and just kind of immigrants coming from faraway lands, hardly speaking the language. And of course, my life, I've kind of reinforced this kind of adventurous gene. So it says, whatever baby you would produce is potentially could become a maniac.
Especially if you
pair it with
if
another
the mother
maniac.
Happened to be someone who you met on Easter Island, and but
who got there on a kayak.
right, and of course there's genetics there. There's also, of course, like with any biological thing, there's environment factors too, because maybe your child would be born on the road, or you've grown up with the example of your parents who traveled, and so to you, travel is a thing that's not unfamiliar.
And that ends this episode of the WanderLearn podcast, where we explore travel, technology, and transformation. If you'd like to see the show notes with links to what we've talked about, go to wanderlearn.com and click on this episode. If you'd like to connect with me, just remember Tapon. That's my first initial and my last name. Tapon is always my social media username. My website is ftapon.com. Do you want to leave me an anonymous voicemail where you can make a comment or ask a question? Then go to speakpipe.com/ftapon. Furthermore, if you'd like to get rewarded for supporting my projects, then go to patreon.com/ftapon. That's where you can pick up some remarkable rewards for as little as $2 a month. Now, 5 quick favors. Number 1, subscribe to the WanderLearn podcast. 2, download it. 3, share it. 4, review it, and 5, sign up for my newsletter at WanderLearn.com. Our theme music was composed by Eric Stratman. This is Francis Tapon, encouraging you to wander and learn.